Imagine a moment so shocking, so cruel, that it burns itself into memory. A moment that exposes the darkest corners of human behavior, yet carries a lesson we cannot ignore. Today you are about to hear a story that is as haunting as it is real. A story of cruelty, of injustice, and of the unexpected ways life can turn the tables. It is a story that will make you pause, reflect and understand something deeper about the world, and about human nature. We travel back in time, to an era when freedom was a dream for many, and life hung by the thinnest of threads. An era in which human beings were bought, sold, and forced to endure unimaginable suffering. This is the American slavery era, a time when fear ruled the fields, and cruelty often wore the face of authority. It is in this world, under the blazing sun, and amidst endless toil, that the story you are about to hear unfolds. You will meet figures who seem larger than life in their power, yet are small in the choices they make when confronted with morality. You will encounter courage, hidden in silence, dignity that refuses to break, and injustice so raw it makes your blood run cold. But most importantly, you will witness consequences, swift, poetic and unavoidable. This is not a story found in textbooks. It is not a sanitized tale, carefully edited to comfort the conscience. This is the real human experience, raw and unfiltered. The kind of story that shakes you to your core, yet teaches truths that echo through generations. As we move through it, you will discover the fine line between cruelty and reckoning, the moment when arrogance meets its inevitable downfall, and how even in the darkest corners of history, actions, both vile and virtuous, leave echoes that cannot be erased. By the end of this video, you will understand why history's harshest lessons are not just stories of the past. You will see how power misused leaves scars, not only on those who suffer, but on those who wield it without conscience. You will grasp how even a single act of cruelty can ripple across lives, shaping destinies in ways that are often hidden, yet unmistakable. And while the tale may shock you, it is also a story of truth and clarity. A story that asks you to look closely at human behavior, to recognize patterns, and to awaken a sense of justice and awareness that is timeless. It challenges you to reflect on morality, accountability, and the consequences of our choices. So stay with me, listen closely. Let yourself be drawn into a narrative that is as painful as it is illuminating. This is not just a story about one person, one moment, or one act. This is a story about humanity, and the lessons it leaves behind. By the end you will see why understanding this history is essential, not just for remembering the past, but for shaping a future where justice, empathy and awareness prevail. Before we talk about the events that changed lives forever, it's important to understand the figure at the center of this story, the overseer. On plantations during the American slavery era, the overseer was more than just a supervisor. He was a person entrusted with absolute authority over the enslaved, a figure whose presence alone could create fear. His power was not balanced by fairness or law. There was no accountability, no system to check his actions. He could dictate life and death in ways that were often cruel and arbitrary, and many times, he did. The role of the overseer was simple to define but devastating in effect. He enforced work, ensuring that every enslaved person labored from sunrise to sunset. Fields were harsh, and the work was relentless. The overseer made sure that quotas were met, that crops were harvested on schedule, and that discipline was maintained. If someone slowed down, if someone faltered, the overseer was the one who decided the punishment. Whips, verbal abuse, threats and humiliation were common tools in his arsenal. Even a minor mistake could trigger harsh consequences. The overseer's authority extended beyond work. It governed the daily lives of those who had no rights, no voice, and no protection. Power in the hands of the overseer was absolute. Unlike the plantation owner, who might live far from the fields, the overseer was on the ground, watching every move. He was both feared and resented because he could turn small acts of defiance into deadly outcomes. He commanded obedience not through respect or leadership, but through intimidation. He could manipulate, punish, and humiliate with complete impunity. This kind of power often led to abuse, because there were no limits and no consequences for wrongdoing. History records countless stories where overseers acted with cruelty that went unchecked, leaving scars that would last generations. Being an overseer was a position that came with authority, but also with moral choices, though few exercised them. Many allowed the systemic violence to guide their actions, enforcing rules with an iron fist, and deriving satisfaction from the fear they inspired. To the enslaved, the overseer represented the most immediate threat to life and dignity. He was the living embodiment of oppression on the plantation, a daily reminder that freedom was denied and survival was uncertain. Every look, every gesture, every order from the overseer carried weight. It was a constant test of endurance, resilience, and courage. At the same time, the overseer's role highlights a dark truth about human behavior under systems of power. Absolute authority, without accountability, can corrupt absolutely. The overseer could exploit this power in countless ways, through violence, through degradation and through fear, and history shows us that many did. Yet understanding the overseer's position is crucial, because it sets the stage for the story you are about to hear. The cruelty that unfolds is not isolated, it is a product of a system designed to dehumanize and subjugate. Knowing who the overseer was, and the power he wielded, helps us grasp the magnitude of the events, the suffering endured, and the moral consequences that inevitably followed. This power, unchecked and often brutal, shaped the lives of everyone on the plantation. It created an environment where fear was constant, where obedience was enforced by terror, and where the smallest act could trigger devastating outcomes. It is in this context that we see not just cruelty, but a system that relied on fear to maintain control, a system that made the actions of one man, a cruel overseer, have profound and lasting consequences for those he ruled over. Fear was a constant companion. The overseer, whip in hand, watched closely, ensuring that no one slowed their pace or disobeyed orders. Even the slightest hesitation could bring punishment, and the sound of the whip cracking across the fields was a warning that obedience was not optional. The overseer's presence turned routine labor into an exercise in terror. Every movement had to be calculated, every action performed with precision, because a misstep could mean injury, humiliation, or worse. The enslaved lived under the shadow of that whip, their lives controlled by a system that demanded total compliance without mercy. But the hardships of daily life went beyond fear and labor. Basic needs were often neglected. Food was scarce, poorly prepared, and insufficient to sustain the long hours of work demanded. Meals might consist of a small portion of cornmeal, or a few vegetables, with little or no protein, leaving the body weak and vulnerable. Shelter was barely adequate, crude cabins with dirt floors, thin walls, and no protection from the harsh elements. Families often lived in cramped conditions, with no privacy and little warmth, enduring cold winters and scorching summers with minimal relief. Medical care, when it existed at all, was primitive, and often inadequate. Illnesses and injuries that would be minor under normal circumstances became life-threatening. Wounds could fester, infections could spread, and disease could claim lives quickly. The enslaved had few resources and little hope for proper treatment. Even minor ailments could slow a worker's pace, inviting punishment from the overseer who demanded perfection in every task. The combination of poor nutrition, inadequate shelter, and lack of medical attention made survival itself a constant struggle. Yet amid the toil and fear, life continued. People found small ways to endure, to survive, and to retain fragments of dignity. Families clung together, whispered stories offered comfort, and quiet acts of resistance reminded them of their humanity. Still, the daily grind was unrelenting. Each sunrise brought another day of sweat, suffering and vigilance, with the overseer ever present, watching, judging, ready to strike. Understanding the daily life of the enslaved helps us see the reality behind the stories of cruelty and oppression. It was not just a system of forced labor, it was a life lived in constant tension between survival and suffering, between fear and resilience. The fields, the cabins, and the meager meals tell a story of hardship that is both brutal and instructive. This was a world where human endurance was tested beyond measure, and where the presence of power and punishment shaped every breath, every step, and every decision of those who lived under it. Before we talk about the heartbreaking story that lies at the center of this video, we need to understand the reality that enslaved people lived through every day, because their voices and testimonies reveal truths that shock the soul. In the words of those who survived, the brutality of slavery was not an abstract idea. It was a daily experience of pain, fear and punishment that could be inflicted for the smallest mistake. In one account from former slaves, an overseer built a gallows-like structure where a person's fingers were tied so that their toes barely touched the ground. There, Men and women were whipped with a cat o' nine tails, a whip with 9 straps designed to tear flesh and leave deep lasting welts. After the beating, salt and pepper water was often poured on the wounds, making the pain even worse. Women, even if pregnant, were given no mercy. These weren't exaggerations, these were real experiences spoken by people who lived through it, and told their stories later in life. In another narrative, a man described being whipped so many times that the marks remained on his back for years afterward. Testimony he showed others as proof of how relentless the violence was. And it didn't take much to earn such punishment. Crossing a road without permission could lead to severe beating. Simply not working fast enough could land someone tied up, starved, or locked in a room for days without water or food, because the overseer believed they hadn't done enough. One former enslaved person recalled how bushes or weeds left in a field, or crops not cleared exactly to the overseer's satisfaction, meant a whipping, every time. The records from the Federal Writers Project contain even harsher stories of punishment that went far beyond whipping. One remembered a slave who received 500 lashes, and was thrown back into the cabin to die. In the morning, when the overseer came to check, he kicked the woman to see if she was still alive. She wasn't. Her body was lifeless and cold, leaving her children motherless. These narratives show that whipping was not the only punishment. Some slaves saw bloodhounds used to track those who tried to escape, dogs that were trained to follow the scent of human blood left from the cruel beatings. Library of Congress, 4. Another account from slave narratives describes how slaves were beaten until their flesh was raw, sometimes so severely that others who saw the aftermath were terrified by the sight of their wounded bodies. Imagine what that did to a person's spirit. A simple task left unfinished, a momentary lag in the fields, a perceived slight, any of these could lead to punishment that changed a body forever and scarred a mind with fear. These were not isolated incidents, these were the kinds of experiences many enslaved people lived through and later recounted to historians. This piercing honesty in the narratives reveals a system built on power without pity. It shows how punishment was used not just to enforce labor, but to break the human spirit. The smallest perceived mistake could become a reason for brutal punishment, and the threat of pain was constant. Understanding these personal accounts helps us grasp just how brutal and unforgiving that world was, and why the story we are about to hear matters so deeply. Before we talk about the moment that defines this story, we must meet the woman at its center. She was not just a figure in history. She was a living, breathing human being who endured suffering beyond what most of us can imagine. Her days were filled with back-breaking labor, her nights with little rest, and every moment marked by the shadow of fear. She had been subjected to the cruel rhythm of the plantation, forced to perform tasks that left her body battered and exhausted. Over time, injuries accumulated, bruises, cuts and wounds that never had the chance to heal. Each scar told a story of punishment, each ache, a reminder of the relentless demands placed upon her. By the time the events of this story took place, she was already near death. Her body, worn down by exhaustion and abuse, was fragile and trembling. Even a minor misstep could have been fatal, and yet she continued, driven by necessity, resilience, and a quiet will to survive. The work never stopped, and neither did the oversight of those who held power over her life. Every breath she took carried the weight of fear, pain and uncertainty. The injuries she bore were not just physical, they were symbolic of the oppression that had surrounded her from the moment she had been enslaved. Despite her suffering, she remained in the fields, enduring whatever tasks were demanded of her. Her strength was a testament to human resilience, yet in that moment, she was painfully vulnerable. She could not defend herself against those who wielded power with cruelty, nor could she escape the system that had trapped her. Helplessness became a constant companion, a silent shadow that loomed over her every action. Even as her body failed her, her dignity quietly endured, though it was tested at every turn by the harsh reality of her life. The helpless state she found herself in was made even more cruel by the actions of the overseer. At a time when she needed care and compassion, she instead faced disdain and contempt. Her injuries, her frailty, and her exhaustion became objects of scorn rather than reasons for mercy. She lay on the ground, unable to rise, unable to protect herself, fully exposed to the will of a man who chose cruelty over compassion. It is this contrast, between her vulnerability and his callousness, that makes the story so striking, so unforgettable, and so important to understand. As we focus on her, we see more than just the pain. We see the human cost of an oppressive system. Every injury, every act of forced labor, every day of fear built upon the last, leaving her body fragile and her spirit tested. She represents the countless individuals who suffered silently under the weight of slavery, whose stories were rarely told, and whose lives were marked by endurance in the face of unimaginable hardship. Understanding her helpless state is essential, because it sets the stage for what comes next. It is in this moment of vulnerability, at the edge of life and death, that the consequences of cruelty become undeniable. Her injuries and suffering are not abstract, they are real, tangible, and deeply moving. They remind us of the inhumanity that existed, the strength required to endure, and the stakes of every action taken by those who wielded power without conscience. In seeing her suffering, we are forced to confront both the horror of the past and the resilience of those who survived it. Before we talk about the moment that shocks the conscience, we must confront the sheer cruelty of the overseer's actions. The woman, already weakened and near death from exhaustion and injury, lay helpless on the ground. Her body was frail, her breathing shallow, and yet even in this state, the overseer chose to display the worst of human cruelty. He spat on her, and acted in its simplicity, revealed the depth of his callousness. It was not just a gesture of disdain, it was a deliberate statement that her life, her suffering, and her humanity meant nothing to him. Spitting on someone is an act loaded with contempt, a symbolic attempt to erase dignity and assert dominance. But to do so to a dying woman, someone already stripped of strength, safety, and agency, is a cruelty that transcends physical violence. It was a moment that exposed the darkness of unchecked power, a moment where the overseer's authority became a weapon aimed directly at her humanity. There was no need, no justification, only a choice to humiliate, degrade, and assert dominance over a person who could no longer defend herself. In that act, he communicated that she was less than human, less than deserving of compassion, and yet it is precisely this inhumanity that defines the horror of slavery itself. The sheer audacity of his action demonstrates a total disregard for life. He did not pause to consider her pain, her condition, or the consequences of his cruelty. In that moment, he wielded power not for order or necessity, but for sadistic affirmation of his own control. He treated a fragile human being as an object, an obstacle, a target for scorn, a symbol of subjugation. Every observer of this act, whether fellow enslaved people or others present on the plantation, would have felt the weight of the injustice. It was a moment that revealed the moral bankruptcy of a man entrusted with authority over others, a man who chose to wield power not with responsibility, but with ruthless contempt. This act also strips away any illusions about oversight or fairness. It shows how systems built on oppression allow individuals to commit acts of dehumanization without consequence, at least in the moment. The overseer's behavior illustrates a world in which empathy and morality were optional, and cruelty was enforceable. It reminds us that slavery was not just about forced labor or poor living conditions. It was about the deliberate denial of human dignity, the erosion of compassion, and the elevation of arrogance over humanity. Even in her dying state, the woman's vulnerability magnified the inhumanity of the overseer's choice. She could do nothing to stop him. She could only endure his contempt. And that endurance, that silent witness to brutality, speaks volumes about the resilience of the human spirit in the face of absolute disregard. This moment captures the darkest side of authority, a single act that encapsulates the cruelty faced by countless individuals who lived under the shadow of oppression. It is a stark reminder that cruelty can take many forms, and that sometimes, the most devastating acts are not those that leave visible scars, but those that attack dignity, humanity, and the right to be treated as a person. In understanding this moment, we confront a truth that is difficult but necessary, that human cruelty can reach unimaginable depths, and that acts like this leave echoes far beyond the immediate moment. The overseer's choice to spit on her was more than just an insult. It was a deliberate denial of her existence, a stark representation of the systemic oppression that defined an entire era, and a moral lesson that continues to resonate through history. Before we talk about the full impact of what happened, it's important to understand that the overseer's cruelty was never witnessed in isolation. Other enslaved people were forced to watch, often powerless, as their fellow human being was humiliated and abused. Their eyes bore witness to pain and suffering that was beyond comprehension, and their hearts carried the weight of helplessness. Watching someone endure such brutality reminded them of their own vulnerability, a constant message that no one was safe, and that cruelty could strike at any time, for any reason. The sight of the woman being spat upon while she lay weak and near death left an indelible mark on those who watched. It was not just the physical act of abuse that terrorized them, it was the message behind it, the absolute dominance of the overseer, the system that allowed such acts, and the realization that mercy was neither expected nor given. Fear became a tangible presence among them, a heavy, unshakable companion that accompanied every step, every glance, and every task. Every movement in the fields, every spoken word, had to be measured against the possibility of punishment. The overseer's cruelty was a lesson carved into their minds. Obedience was survival, and resistance could mean unimaginable suffering. At the same time, sorrow mingled with fear. They felt grief for the woman, for her suffering, and for the injustice that was inflicted upon her. Empathy did not disappear under oppression, it remained quietly alive, haunting them even as they moved through their daily routines. Their hearts ached not only for her pain but for the broader truth it represented, a life constrained by force, a system that valued obedience over humanity, and a world where dignity could be stripped away without consequence. That sorrow was compounded by the helplessness they felt, knowing that stepping in or attempting to intervene would only bring harm upon themselves. The overseer's actions created a climate where terror and grief were shared experiences. Witnessing one act of brutality was a reminder that each day could bring a new horror. The enslaved lived in a state of constant vigilance, their eyes scanning for danger, their minds calculating how to survive another hour, another day. Every punishment inflicted on one person became a lesson for all, a warning that cruelty was not limited to a single victim, but extended to anyone under the overseer's control. Fear was not abstract, it was lived, felt in the muscles, in the breath, in the nervous anticipation of each moment. And yet, amid this fear and sorrow, there was a silent endurance. Observing such cruelty forced the enslaved to confront the harsh realities of their existence, but it also revealed their resilience. Even as terror pressed upon them, even as grief weighed heavily on their spirits, they continued to survive. They carried the memory of each act, the image of the woman's suffering, as both a wound and a warning. It shaped their understanding of power, injustice, and the fragility of life under oppression. In witnessing such acts, they were not mere spectators, they were participants in a shared tragic experience of human suffering. Fear and sorrow were intertwined, each reinforcing the other, creating an environment where survival required careful obedience, quiet endurance, and the painful knowledge that cruelty could strike at any time. This collective witnessing of brutality left scars that were invisible yet profound, shaping their lives in ways that extended far beyond that single devastating moment. Before we talk about the significance of what happened to the dying woman, it is important to see this incident in the larger context of history. The cruelty she faced was not an isolated moment, nor was it simply the result of one man's malice. Across plantations, overseers were documented in countless narratives as wielding power with brutality and impunity. The stories recorded in the slave narratives collected by historians like Albert Paya reveal a pattern of violence, fear, and dehumanization that was deeply entrenched in the system of slavery. These narratives are filled with accounts of overseers who whipped, starved, and punished enslaved people for acts as minor as speaking out of turn, resting too long, or making a small mistake in their work. In many of these accounts, the overseer's role extended beyond supervision. It became an instrument of terror. One former enslaved person recalled how overseers would whip entire groups of people to assert control, using public punishment as a tool to reinforce obedience. Another described being locked in small dark rooms for days as a lesson for failing to meet expectations in the fields. The physical and psychological toll of these punishments was immense, and it became clear that the system was designed not only to extract labor, but also to break the human spirit. What stands out in these narratives is how methodical the cruelty often was. Acts of violence were not random, they were systematic, carefully imposed to maintain dominance and instill fear. The overseer who spat on the dying woman was participating in a culture of dehumanization that had been built over generations. Scholars note that such behavior was encouraged implicitly and explicitly by plantation owners, who relied on fear as a means to ensure labor productivity. When cruelty becomes routine, It is no longer an anomaly, it is part of a structure, a mechanism by which an entire society enforced inequality and control. Slave narratives repeatedly emphasized that small acts could trigger large punishments, and yet these punishments were rarely questioned or restricted. This meant that overseers had free rein to act on impulse or malice, with the full backing of a system that protected their authority. The cruelty of one overseer reflected a broader reality, a society that normalized violence against those it enslaved, and a system in which human life and dignity were consistently devalued. From the stories collected across plantations, it becomes evident that the suffering of individuals like the dying woman was not unique. It was part of a pattern repeated countless times, shaping the daily lives of everyone who lived under slavery. Understanding this context is crucial. It shows that the acts we witness in one story are not exceptions but symptoms of a deeply entrenched brutal system. Overseers did not act in isolation, they operated within a culture that permitted, encouraged, and even celebrated cruelty as a way to maintain control. Recognizing this allows us to see the dying woman's suffering not just as a singular tragedy, but as a representation of a widespread systematic oppression. Her story, while deeply personal, mirrors the experiences of thousands of others, offering insight into the pervasive and organized cruelty that defined this dark chapter in history. In connecting individual acts to the broader system, we begin to understand the scale and structure of oppression. The overseer's contempt, the violence inflicted, and the disregard for human life were all part of a deliberate framework designed to enforce obedience, suppress resistance, and perpetuate suffering. This was not random cruelty, it was structural, systemic, and enduring, leaving scars that reached far beyond any single incident. In the end, what we have explored is more than just a historical event, it is a window into the personal suffering that lies behind the numbers and statistics we often hear about slavery. Each story, each life affected represents real pain, real endurance, and real humanity. The dying woman, the overseer, and the countless others who lived under oppression remind us that history is not just dates and facts, it is lived experience, filled with courage, resilience, and heartbreak. Understanding these individual stories helps us connect with the past in a deeper, more meaningful way. It allows us to see the human cost of injustice and oppression, and it teaches us lessons about empathy, morality, and the consequences of cruelty. When we remember these lives, we honor them and ensure that the suffering, struggles, and courage of those who came before us are never forgotten. If this story moved you, made you reflect, or helped you see history through the eyes of those who lived it, make sure to like this video. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, so you never miss stories that reveal the truth behind history and the lessons it holds for all of us.